All right. On today's episode, we interviewed Steve Divitkos, and we talked about really what it's like to go do your first search fund, right, and grow that business. All of the challenges that you face as a CEO, right? It is lonely at the top, both in terms of, being able to vent to somebody, being able to digest, and very few people really understand what it's like to be a CEO unless you've been one. And then really shifted that conversation into search fund that he's currently doing, right? And how what are some of the traits that he's looking for, both in searchers, and what is some of the value that he can give his, searchers that he invests in? So, Casey, what were some of your takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot, right? Compassion and all of those things. Like Steve's the kind of guy you want to be your investor,
and he's straightforward,
and you can tell, very smart guy. But to be able to take a company from soup to nuts, basically, I bought it, I searched it, I sold it, I raised money, and I built it 7 years, and I exited.
And recognize that you've done all you can do for that business, right? So it's time
to have that self-awareness, to be able to say it's huge. And then we even get into some of the nuts and bolts of like, what is a step up, and why does the initial investor that doesn't choose to participate, why do they get a step up? These little nuances that I think are really important if you're searching, if you're thinking about raising a fund. I just think overall, what a great podcast.
I completely agree. I mean, searching is hard, operating is hard, selling is hard, and investing is hard. So lots of different facets of the business being poked on this one. So definitely listen in.
Hey guys, go ahead and just pause the podcast for a second. When you're buying a business, you need to ensure the financial health of the company. Quality of earnings is mission critical. It doesn't matter what size business you're buying. Patrick O'Connell Advisory Group, they're dynamic. They do a great job. They're going to look over your shoulder. They're going to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And this guy's done over 200 buyers successfully, just like you. So reach out to him. And it's O'ConnellAdvisoryGroup.com. Click the link in our show notes. Can't live without this.
Hey, Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys.
That was great. I mean, I think it sounds like we saw you a few weeks ago at Harvard with Casey, and it was good to kind of hear a little bit more of your story and share it with the audience.
Yeah, and that ETA conference is pretty cool. I like to go. It's my third time.
Yeah, we like to say, Harvard. Casey never attended Harvard formally, but he's been there for 3 years. So.
That's right. That's got to count for something, right?
Awesome. So, Steve, tell us a little bit more about, obviously you've done the traditional search, you're on the search fund side. So it'd be good for our listeners to really hear a little bit more about your story. And maybe let's kick off with just how you got into search to begin with.
Sure. So coming out of undergrad, I began my career in private equity and worked there for a couple of years. And though I enjoyed that experience as much as the next person, it never really struck me as like what I was meant to do for the rest of my life. It very much always just felt like a job to me, a good job, but a job nonetheless. And at the time I had very entrepreneurial ambitions, but I didn't know exactly what form they might take. So I left in 2010 to go to business school. And for me, business school was 2 years to explore, experiment, be introspective as much as it was anything else. I had never heard of search funds going into business school. But once I did learn about them, I got intrigued for a number of different reasons that I'd be happy to discuss if that would be of interest. But long story short, I raised a traditional search fund in my second year of business school, which was 2012, and then started a search out of Toronto, which is where I'm originally from and still am to this day.
Let me pause right there really quick. So private equity, right? What was the company doing? Was it focused on buying businesses and you kind of got that visibility into the space, or was it something else?
So I worked for the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, which is the independent entity charged with managing the assets of 20 million working Canadians. And I worked in their private credit group, their funds group, and their infrastructure private equity group. So I think like folks who come from consulting and private equity and investment banking, there's a certain desire to like get on the field, so to speak, after standing on the sidelines in a way for a number of years. And that's what really, really attracted to me. I often joked with my wife at the time. I think I said something to the effect of like, I'm tired of being a food critic. I want to be a chef. And so that kind of maybe encapsulates.
Sometimes the analogy, it's a great analogy.
And you interact with some people and you're like, if that person could do it, I can do it too, kind of thing. Right. And so.
Yeah. So the desire to be an operator was certainly there. I think like most searchers, I didn't have that one big idea. And for better or for worse, I've just never been the venture funded startup guy. Nobody I know would ever describe me that way. And so when I learned about the fact that I could buy my way into the entrepreneurial career that I had been seeking, that was very appealing to me.
Yeah. And I think you went to Harvard for your MBA, is that right?
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing because 2012, the ETA was still a very new thing, right? And I think Harvard is one of the people on the forefront of all of that. And so timing,
They just had the 10th.
It just had the 10th. So it must have been a small ecosystem. And then you also took that and went to Toronto. So you're probably one of 3 people in all of Toronto doing a search fund, right?
Yeah. So you guys mentioned the fact that we had just come home from the search conference a couple weeks ago. There's probably like 1,200 people there. When I was there in 2012, A, there was no conference, B, there was no ETA club, and C, it was the first year that the two professors who were still teaching the course offered an ETA class. And at the time, there was 12 of us in the entire section. And now I think there's two sections of 90, and it's among the top three most requested courses within the second year. So certainly it has come a long, long way since then.
How lucky were you? Because so the older gentleman that teaches, it also was a searcher and a buyer. His name is he's the
Jim
guy.
Sharp?
Yeah, man, to have that guy as like your teacher, I mean, that's got to be worth its weight in gold. I mean,
Yeah, I was fortunate to be taught by Jim Sharp, who's been a lifelong mentor to me and still is. I think we spoke yesterday, and Royce Yitkoff and Rick Ruback, who are still teaching the ETA class at HBS today.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to know each of them personally has just been a huge blessing.
Yeah, so Steve, you're an OG, right? And for those that don't know, because I thought my CFO didn't know what an OG was. I guess previous generation means original gangster. So one of the first people there. So, you kind of got to see it all happen. And so walk us through, that journey, right? You got exposed to ETA. Okay, I'm going to do a traditional search fund.
I got to raise money.
And you went back to Toronto and, how did you raise the money? And then what was the goals of the search? And then what did you ultimately find?
Yeah, so search was certainly less established back then than it is today. I wouldn't call me an OG. I think that like the real OGs came 20 years before me, and those are the guys and gals that I still talk to and lean on for advice today. So I don't want to suggest that I am a pioneer in any way, shape, or form. But like I said, I moved back home to Toronto to do a Canadian focused search. At the time, I think I was maybe like the third or fourth or fifth Canadian search fund. Now there's a lot. I wasn't looking at any particular industry. I came from a generalist background by way of my private equity experience. And so I didn't necessarily have the luxury of saying something to the effect of, I have a lot of experience in industry XYZ, therefore I want to acquire an industry XYZ. So almost by default, I took kind of a agnostic approach. At the time, software was a very unpopular place to acquire within the search ecosystem. Again, 14 years later, whatever it is, that is totally flipped on its head. But I ended up buying a software company from a father-son co-founding team. The company was 20 years old when I first knocked on their door. And the father and son had been running it since they founded it in the basement of their family home. And I think I caught the right people at the right time who were looking to sell for the right reasons. And from start to finish, the search took just under 2 years. And then I ran the company for about 7 years as the CEO.
Got it. And so really quick, right, before we kind of dive into the company, walk us through that search that you put on. So not only where did you search, but I'm actually asking at the time, right, very few people knew what a search fund was, right? How much did you raise? And, kind of how did you raise that money, right? It's a lot easier now, right? And similar to what you're doing today, right? It's easier for a searcher to build relationships and source money. How did you do it back in 2012?
Yeah, so back then it was actually much more common to raise some portion of your cap table from folks in your personal network. Now, I don't come from money. I don't have a rich uncle that I can call. And so my network was limited largely to like the people with whom I had worked. And so my first call was my boss at the private equity firm. And I had to explain to him, understandably for quite a while, like what the hell is a search fund? For reasons that I still can't articulate to this day, he did decide to invest, and he's actually an investor still in my current fund. And at the time, that was actually pretty important optically for search fund investors to see that, hey, someone who knows you intimately has decided to invest in you. Again, in Canada, there was almost a non-existent search ecosystem. So I did what any good searcher would do, which is roll up the sleeves and start cold calling. And I was fortunate to leverage the HBS alumni database. And, for some reason, when you're a student, people are infinitely willing to speak to you. And then the minute you're not a student, that totally changes. But I cold emailed, cold called Canadians in the HBS database. And I spent my second year in business school flying around both the US and Canada, trying to sell people on this idea. So about half of my cap table were people who didn't even know what search funds were before me reaching out to them. And the other half was like a pretty familiar cast of characters by way of like the search investment community.
And Steve, when you say a traditional search, so you're going to raise, and I'm more for our listeners, right? So you're going to raise enough money to support you to do a search, right? You're going to pay yourself a salary, so you got to raise that first tranche.
Yep.
And then once you raise that first tranche, you're then going to start searching for a business. And then once you find that business, You're then going to call those investors and say, hey, I've got a business, and then it's time for you guys to basically participate. And they can either choose to not participate or to put in the money that they need based on their original investment to then fund the overall.
Yeah, that's correct. And so I raised.
Were you using leverage in your acquisition, or were you raising the whole thing as to buy the whole business out?
Yeah, no, we used a little bit of debt at the time. The complexion of a typical software acquisition was very different from what it is today, and so we had lots of EBIT against which lenders were willing to lend. And so I think, as far as I remember, I think our capitalization going in was like roughly 50-50 mix of debt and equity. In 2012, I raised 12 units in my search fund. Of those 12 units, 9 elected to participate in the acquisition, and 3 declined. And then
what happens to those 3?
And how much is a unit for those listeners to kind of get a sense as to like what we're talking about?
Yeah, we're curious. We love it.
Yeah.
You know?
So the average is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like $30,000 to $50,000 per unit. There's some variation, and folks structure it in different ways, but on average, that's a reasonably safe assumption. I think I was directionally in that ballpark, though it was a long time ago. So the amount of money that I raised was quite a bit lower than what folks are raising today. And so what happened to those
forced you to be scrappy, right? I mean, some people are able to raise infinite money, and that's actually a detriment. So.
Yeah, I mean,
to kind of have it a little bit less.
My parents kind of joked, maybe it wasn't so much of a joke, that like I was the only person they knew who went to Harvard Business School to take a 50% pay cut from what I was doing prior to attending HBS. But
sounds like my conversation with my parents about me leaving and quitting Microsoft. So I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, when you're an entrepreneur, you do what you got to do, right?
Yeah.
So 12 participated in units, nine moved forward to the next round. And then what happened to the 3 that did not participate? Does their money just go? What happens to their money?
So the 3 units that don't participate, their capital contribution gets stepped up by a factor of 1.5x. So for example, if they originally gave me $30,000, even though they elected not to participate in the acquisition, that $30,000 gets multiplied by 1.5 to equal $45,000. And then they are issued 45,000 partnership units in the partnership that acquired the company. And so
is that typical? I actually didn't realize that there's a step up for the people that don't elect.
Yes, very typical. That's been part of the search fund world, substantially for its entire history. The reason why that exists is to give the folks who took the largest risk and gave you capital at the earliest possible time with some source of upside to reflect that additional risk that they assumed.
Nice. That's awesome. Got it. And maybe a side question, did they elect to not invest because they didn't like the business, or, is it just capital constraints?
So funny enough, I guess there's 2 things, right? So at the time, the 3 that chose not to invest explicitly chose not to invest because it was a software company. They said at the time, hey, software, I mean, they didn't use these words, but effectively what they said is that like software is not a suitable place for a search fund to invest. And at the time, that was generally the prevailing wisdom. Fast forward to today, alongside healthcare, software is by a mile the most popular place in which search funds invest. So it's come a long way.
To a fault. And like, that's like my background, and we're far from that. And I'm just like, so many of these guys, that's all they're sipping the Kool-Aid on right now.
Yeah. So that was kind of the reason that it happened in my case. Now, as an investor in search funds and with the benefit of 14 years, I mean, I could say equity gaps are very, very common. And, what I've learned over the years, and this will sound very obvious to say, but, reasonable people, when presented with identical information at the very same time, can reasonably disagree with each other. And so with the searchers in whom I invest today, we'll sometimes disagree on whether or not a given target company is suitable for them. It doesn't mean one of us is right or one of us is wrong. It's just reasonable people disagree. So, folks who are listening to this that might have an equity gap, it doesn't mean you have a bad deal. It doesn't mean much of anything. It just means that investing is as much art as it is science, maybe more so. And again, reasonable people can and very frequently do disagree.
Great advice. All right. So now you've got your 9 people participating, and you're going in and you're closing the deal. So this is after 2 years of searching. Got it.
Yeah.
Now you're ready to go. You got a little debt. You got some debt. You got some equity, and now you're in the business. So how's that first year?
Yeah. And how many employees was it too? To give people kind of size.
I think it was 33 employees when we bought it. The first year was an absolute hurricane. I often say that like you'll learn more in your first month running a business than you will in the 8 months of due diligence that preceded the purchase. and that is true even if you run the world's greatest due diligence process, which no searcher does, obviously, and nor should they be expected to run such a process. It's funny, in my first week, on the advice of a mentor of mine, I did nothing except for meet with every single employee one on one for an hour. And that took 2 weeks. And I guess human nature being what it is, all I heard was negatives, right? Here's what we suck at. Here's, what we need to change, et cetera, et cetera. And I just remember kind of emerging from the conference room after the conclusion of those first 2 weeks and asking myself, like, geez, like, what the hell did I just buy? It's just problem after problem after problem. My goodness. What I've come to learn since then is that that's, not necessarily reflective of reality, just human beings being who we are. We tend to focus on the negative when asked for feedback in that type of context.
Not on that, and your seat that you are in is the seat to solve problems, right? And and the best example I like to give is, so I worked at Microsoft. I was on the Windows team. It takes 3 years to ship a version of Windows, right? And so you're working on this thing for 3 years, and guess what? The entire time you're working on problems. You're not working on the good stuff. And so you get close to release, and you're like, "This is a dumpster fire. Nobody in the world is going to use this piece of crap," right? And then you go to launch, and there's the press, there's everybody seeing all the good stuff, and you almost forget about it because you're so deep in solving problems. And so as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, as an executive, right, the goal is not to bring, hey, look at the great things and put it on your plate. It's actually, hey, let me bring the challenge, the problem to you to help us to solve it. I mean, that's the seat that you're in, and you have to be comfortable with that. And some people aren't made out for that, right? It's a lot of negativity sometimes, and people just can't handle that. And those are the people that can't excel. So
yeah, there's two quotes that come to mind, neither of which I came up with. The first is shit rolls uphill, which is probably a good encapsulation of what you have to deal with as a CEO. And the second is that companies are almost never doing as well as they seem to be doing from the outside looking in, nor are they ever doing as poorly as they seem to be doing from the inside looking out. And that was definitely true in my experience.
not heard that second one, but I do like that one. That one actually kind of resonates with a lot of the stuff that I try to say.
Yeah, like all good quotes that come out of my mouth, I did not come up with that.
All right, so now we're in you're in your first year. Let's just say, like, first couple things as a searcher, like you.
Yeah, what were some biggest changes you made?
Yeah, big changes.
A lot of the changes that I made were the changes that I was entirely unready to make. I think the prevailing wisdom in the search community, rightly so, is to take a pretty light touch in the first 6 to 12 months, not disturb too much, etc. That is generally the right thing to do. However, my experience taught me that, like, problems do not wait to present themselves until you are ready to handle them, because you are taking over a real business with real employees and real problems and real bottlenecks. And whether you are ready to handle them or not, they still need to be handled. And so early on in my tenure, a couple of things I had to deal with was we had to make a very meaningful change within our senior leadership team. The one-on-one interviews I had with the employees yielded the conclusion, very strong conclusion, that a particular team had lost faith in their leader. And I had to make a change, even though I was entirely unready to make that change. But it was essentially forced upon me. Another thing that I tried to do that was a bit more...
Can we dive into that really quick? Because this is something that I think is important for young entrepreneurs to learn. And I've been in that same seat multiple times. And was your experience the same that I've had, which is you kind of dread it. You make the change. And then like a week later, you're like, man, this should have been made 6 months ago. Right. And we all tend to reflect on, hey, if this person is gone, now I have all these other challenges to solve. But we also, similar to your quote, actually, you forget about if this person is gone, look at all the things that have improved. And that outweighs the work that kind of gets created from making that change.
Yeah, I mean, with that specific change, I was so new to the business that I couldn't have made that decision 6 months ago, even if I wanted to, because I was not yet working in the company. However, I can tell you from hiring and firing successes and mistakes that I had while I was the CEO, in every single instance in which I had a gut feeling that said, I should move on from this person, I was never once wrong. And the mistake that I made every single time, I made it a lot less in the years 5, 6, and 7, a lot more in years 1, 2, and 3, is I waited too long to make the change. And so, the biggest regret of most CEOs is waiting too long to make a change. I've almost never heard a CEO say, I made that change too quickly.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree and resonate with that. And so then you were going to go down the second other change you were about to mention making?
Yeah, I think just for first-time CEOs, for whatever it's worth, it might be worth saying this, to focus on like quick and small wins. Remember that like when you are a new, particularly like a young, inexperienced CEO, most people look at you reasonably skeptically. And again, human beings being who we are, we tend to interpret change through the lens of like fear, right? So most frequently we'll ask, what does this mean for me? And how might this put me in some sort of danger? I.e., am I at risk of losing my job? And so really, really early, I always encourage searchers and CEOs to try to just begin the process of building a foundation of trust with the employees. And importantly, people are going to watch, listen to what you say, but most importantly, watch what you do. So for example, are there small, quick wins that you can jump on? So in our case, like our customer support team was using a crazy outdated piece of software. It was preventing them from doing their job effectively. So within like the first 30 days, I tasked the manager with like finding a replacement and ripping it out and replacing it within, I think, 90 days from the date that that decision was made. Support team was thrilled, right? Small change. An even smaller change was we had a administrative assistant who's actually very, very important to the business. And she sat by herself in the reception area. And she kind of just innocently mentioned, hey, it would be nice if I had like a radio or something to keep me company because I get kind of lonely, right? I went on Amazon that night and I bought her a radio. It cost $40. And, she was absolutely thrilled. We had a employee social event within our first 2 weeks, right? And the company didn't really do a ton of that prior to my arrival. So not saying that I deserve a bunch of credit because these are very straightforward changes, but I guess the takeaway for me for new CEOs is do not underestimate the power of a large number of seemingly small changes, just in the interest of building that foundation of trust that you'll really need to lean on once you start making real changes.
Yeah, 100% agree. I mean, it's important to show positive momentum for people, right? And then it gets much easier to get the buy-in later for the more complex nuances.
That's right. So I did a solo acquisition in October 19. And I did not get a chance to make subtle changes because we bought a commodity-based business. I did not use a searcher mentality. I didn't even read a book and just had done some things. And oil prices collapsed on us. It became pure duress. And then COVID happened, right? And so all of a sudden, as a new owner, it's just like hair on fire. It's like, oh my God, what do you do now? So, didn't get a chance at. Now, when we closed on H&M in May, our deal it's
a chrome plating company. So, boring, blue collar, dirty, grimy kind of facility.
160 employees, right? So with the husband or the brother and sister that ran the business and sister leaving, she was admin. I focused on changing over payroll, getting the benefits right. I focused that first 6 months to just improve really the employee's life, quality of life with better things. And rode that for about 6 months. And then we brought in an operating partner that came in and kind of took over the reins. And I think we might have gone a little too hard, too fast on change, right? Because at 6 months, we were like, hey, let's go to work. And hindsight, we probably could have just sat in and let him sit in for like another 6 months before we start going into these operational change, because we got into the deep stuff. And maybe hindsight, it's that 12-month might have been that window for us. So it's just a learning thing, but all of a sudden it's like you get into it and it's like starts happening. It's a life of its own.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. Again, like I think that the prevailing wisdom is the correct wisdom, which is take a light touch, listen more than you speak, etc. But again, the countervailing force to that is you're taking over a real business with real problems and real opportunities and real decisions that need to get made. And those problems do not wait to present themselves until you're ready to handle them.
Very true. All right, so take us down a few roads. So this was in 2014, and then it sounds like you had an exit in 2020.
Yeah.
Right. So tell us the exciting part, the back end of the journey.
And were you looking to sell? I mean, kind of how all that came to be.
Yeah, the path from entry to exit and the growth and all that stuff. It was not linear. It was not smooth. It was not easy. It was. I often say being a CEO and being an entrepreneur in that context was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I hope it will remain the hardest thing that I will ever do in my career. I often say quite unapologetically that nobody knows what it's like to be a CEO unless you have been one, full stop. So we actually tried to sell the business in 2018 unsuccessfully. We hired an investment bank. We ran a full process from start to finish. It took about a year, very, very time consuming process. But the deal ended up falling apart with a private equity buyer in 2018. And at that point, we kind of had a choice as a board. Do we re-engage with the second place bidder that we haven't spoken to in 6 months? Or do we put our heads down and just keep building and making the changes that we learned are particularly important throughout the course of trying to sell the company? We chose the latter. So we ran it for another 2 years. In 2020, probably like mid 2020, I think the decision to sell was honestly mostly a personal one more than it was a commercial one. I had the pleasure and the benefit of working with a fantastic board of directors. And I was very honest with them about struggles that I was having personally at the time. I was battling with like an unhealthy level of anxiety at the time. I think COVID plus 7 years of being a CEO had just led me down a path mentally that I never thought I would be on. And so I just kind of made a personal decision. I said, look, I've given everything that I can to this business. It's been 7 years. I feel like I've hired the people that I think needed to be hired, made the changes that I think needed to be made. And I'm kind of done. I don't really have, X more years left in me. And I told my board that, and they were very supportive, as they always were, and they continue to be. And they basically said, I think they might have used these exact words. They said, like, if the conductor wants to get off the train, then I want to get off the train, something like that. And I just got super duper lucky that there was a strategic in our industry that was just competitive enough and just complementary enough that was looking to grow, obviously. And they were looking to grow specifically inorganically. We were looking to sell, and we had kind of, touched base with them a couple times over the years, but we at least, directionally knew each other. And we reached out to them and said, hey, we might be interested in selling. They said, hey, we might be interested in buying. And, fortunately, I think it was like 2 months or three months after that, the company was sold. So the impetus to sell, it was very much a personal decision led by me, as opposed to like something that was purely commercial, though obviously we did have our commercial rationale for it.
No, absolutely. I love the clear honesty about your journey, because I will tell you, man, I have to take in daily meditation. I mean, the amount of intensity stuff I do mornings. I mean, I will not do it, because just for me, I found that helps me just kind of just have that I don't give a shit attitude for a moment, and just like, hey, I'm going to take the day, and it's just a lot. I mean, it's Spitfire. I've been an entrepreneur since I was 21 years old, doing startup and thinking that acquisitions would be easier. And holy shit, the day I close on my business, I have a picture in literally November of 2019 by the big screen in my living room of negative oil prices on MSNBC or what CNBC. And my wife took the picture, and she said, why am I taking this picture? She's totally pissed, right? We personally guaranteed everything. And I said, because this is going to be a great story we're going to tell one day. And she was like, I hope so. And I mean, the tension between she and I for the next year and a half. And we ultimately survived, and the business is still there, but it's constant, like Feras said at the beginning, problem solving over and over again.
Problem solving without clarity on, like right now you're like in a waiting game. I mean, right now I was literally enumerating this yesterday. I had lunch with a friend who's a banker, and I was like, here are the 15 really crazy things going on across our company and all the things that I'm just waiting. I don't know which way the cards are going to fall. And you're just waiting, for certain things, like whether this approval or this thing. And, and anxiety is a serious problem right in our space. I mean, you have to be comfortable having it, right? And it wears on you over time.
And so, Steve, I think at the end of the day, for our listeners, that, that really helps people understand, right? You did everything in the process. You even got to an exit. Right. And even though you made a personal decision, you still got your exit because you'd already been looking for that. Right.
Yeah.
But man, the amount of pressure and the amount of things that you had to deal with in those 7 years, even from the point of view to find the business, search the business, close the business, raise the money for the business, run the business, and exit the business. Whew, man, that's why you're raising a search fund, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. And now, as someone who's lucky enough to invest in search funds and the companies that they acquire, I purposely go out of my way to be the investor that I know I wanted to have when I was a CEO. I'm very happy and very frequently discuss commercial issues, but just as importantly, I try to purposely go out of my way to create a space to discuss personal issues, because I know what it's like to put your head on the pillow at night as a CEO, to feel that immense pressure and illiquidity and uncertainty and anxiety, and the weight of the world is on your shoulders. And I just think that as a community in search, we're getting a lot better at talking about it, but I still think that there's a lot more room for us to talk about the realities of being a CEO. And I often say that, managing your own psychology is just as important as, if not more important than, managing your business. And I did a lousy job of managing my own psychology when I was a CEO. And now I try to go out of my way as an investor to ensure that the CEOs that I work with don't fall into the same trap.
Yeah, because the other thing we're not really talking about is, as a CEO, you're pretty much everybody else's therapist, right? But then it's like, who's your therapist? That's the nice thing I've always had, is I've had partners, Casey, Ben, and we were able to, at least amongst us, just both strategize, then debrief, and kind of get another lens, and that helps. But if you're doing it alone at the top, it is lonely at the top. And so we've all heard the phrase, and there's
and that's why every CEO and every entrepreneur ought to have a literal therapist. It took me probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years into my CEO journey to finally get one. But yeah, all that emotion, all that stress, that's got to go somewhere, and it can't just kind of stay inside of you. And so hiring in help, as you would hire a personal trainer to improve your physical health, you ought to hire a therapist or a coach or something like that to make sure that your mental health is where it ought to be.
Huge.
Completely agree.
So Steve, I know we've got,
really quick, actually, before we put it, I just want to put a bow on this. We can go to the search fund because I do want to talk through that for a minute. But really quick, during the 7 years, right, you took the employee count from what to what, and maybe if you could share revenue or EBITDA, if how much you grew it, whether that be dollars or multiples, or just to kind of give people, a gauge as to what happened over those 7 years.
Yeah. So like I said, when we bought the company, it was about 33 employees. When we sold, I think it was like directionally 75 employees, like somewhere low to mid 70s. And we increased equity value on a gross basis by about 4x. So thankfully, it was a successful outcome. I will not even come close to like the Mount Rushmore of search fund outcomes. I'm pretty like average in that regard, but it was a good economic outcome at the end of the day.
So tapping on before we get into the rocket round, so you currently have a search fund that you're raising money. So you're raising money to participate with other searchers, right? Talk to us.
Yeah, so I'm getting close to Fund 2 now. So Fund 1, the firm's name is Mineola Search Partners.
We'll link that in the show notes for the listeners.
Yeah, thank you. We invest in search funds and the companies that they acquire across Canada and the US. That was started about 3 years ago. Unfortunately, it's worked out reasonably well. So we're soon to be on to Fund 2, where we will continue to invest in searchers across North America and the companies that they acquire. And again, the goal there is in many ways, on one hand, to replicate the best of what I got from my investors. And on the other hand, to kind of be the investor that I wish that I had. And I know that former CEOs, like I said, know what it's like. And hopefully, we conduct ourselves accordingly when we're on the other side of the table.
Yeah, no, and I mean, from just our conversation, Steve, I think you are the kind of investor I'd want as a searcher, right? You get it. There's a lots of ups and downs in the journey, and the last thing as a searcher and as a CEO you want to be dealing with is an antsy investor, right? And I mean, even on we do a lot of real estate. Our best investors are the ones that aren't antsy, right? The ones that, hey, give us the breathing room to kind of go do what we need to do and perform.
Compassion too, man. That you can see the compassion, and that's pretty awesome. And that's what's needed. It's not like, hey, it's not handcuffs, right? We're wanting to grow something special together, and I get that from you very much.
Yeah,
alignment of interest.
All right, now onto our rocket round. So we always ask our guests 3 questions just to get to learn about them personally and learn about a little bit more. All right, so Steve, what do you like to do in your free time?
This is a very boring answer, but I play golf as much as I can. I have 2 kids, so I can't golf that much. Disappearing for 6 hours on a Saturday is no longer something that my wife is willing to tolerate. But to the extent that I can sneak out on a weekday, I like to hack around and play golf as much as I can. It's a good way to get outside, directionally a form of exercise, I suppose. But it's a good hobby that you can totally geek out on. So that's my answer to that one.
That is awesome.
Yeah, see, and I promise to the listeners, sometime in the next 3 years, I'm going to learn to play golf. All right, myself a 3-year window because we interviewed Bill Snow, and he said if you're buying businesses, you have to be doing golf. You are not serious in this space if you're not a golfer. It's pretty much forward how he put it. So, all right, next question. What was your most memorable moment in your business journey?
Most memorable moment in the business journey. That's a good question. I would say maybe I'll answer a slightly different question, which is like the scariest moment or one of the scariest moments was when we bought that company, we were selling software to 5 different end markets. Healthcare, insurance, financial services, transportation, and education, I think. There was a point in 2015, I think it was, where we made the decision basically to fire a very large percentage of our customer base and focus exclusively on transportation and logistics. There was a whole bunch of reasons why we thought we would be better served as a vertical software provider as opposed to a horizontal one. So we did that, whatever, 6 or 7 years later, it ended up working out. But that was a very scary proposition to basically call a very large percentage of our customer base and saying, we don't care about your requirements anymore. And if you want to change that button or add that feature, unless you're a trucking company, our answer is no.
Wow. That is gutsy.
That's
I
bold.
will give you that.
Fortune favors the bold, right? All right. And last question, what is your favorite tool or resource?
I have a bunch of them. I use Calendly a lot. I know that's a super lame answer because Calendly has been around for a very long time, and it is not necessarily a particularly new or novel resource. But I don't have like an administrative assistant, and so the amount of hours that tool has probably saved me is worth its weight in gold. So I'm going to go with a super boring vanilla Calendly.
Oh, for those that don't know,
I've been thinking about I've tried, and I've been thinking about it.
Yeah, and for those that don't know what it is, right, it's obviously a way that shows availability for people, and you give them a link and they can go schedule. So no, it's definitely super convenient. Awesome. Well, I think we'll call that a wrap. So Steve, how can people get a hold of you?
Best way to, if anything that I said resonated, best thing to do would be to actually check out my own podcast, which is called In the Trenches. I've done it for about 4 years now. I do my best to talk about the realities of buying a business, running a business, selling a business, and also managing yourself and your own psychology, and do my best to talk about all the mistakes that I made, of which there are many. And for any areas in which I'm not particularly well suited to talk to through personal experience, I'll interview third parties on various topics spanning, again, managing your business, but also managing yourself. So if anyone is looking for an Ambien replacement to put them straight to bed, that might be where I direct you.
All right, perfect. Steve,
just fantastic.
Thank you.
Really glad we had a chance. I know we had a chance to talk at the conference, but this was great. So very nice to meet you again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for listening to the M&A Launchpad Podcast. If you've enjoyed today's podcast and would like to support us, please leave us a rating and a review after you listen. I'm Casey Minshew, and I look forward to talking with you next week.